So good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar with the title Europe's Most Durable Autonomies, the Åland Island and South Tyrol. My name is Anna-Kira Pierhofer and I'm working for the Center for Autonomy Experience. So I welcome you also in the name of the director of our center, Mark Rögler. And our center was founded about 2 years ago and is part of Eurac research. And we are dealing mainly with the topics autonomy and minority protection in South Tyrol. This webinar today is the second edition of our annual webinar series called Discussing Board Autonomies, which we are co-organizing within the Institute of Minority Rights and the Institute for Comparative Federalism of Eurac research within the project Autonomy Arrangement in the World. And this year we are celebrating 50 years of autonomy in South Tyrol and 100 years autonomy in the Åland Island. So it's a historical moment, and I'm sure we will have a lot interesting to talk about today. Before I give the floor to our project partner and the moderator of this webinar, Karl Kössler, I would like to thank our excellent panelists Spiliopoulou, Åkermark, and Elisabeth Alber for taking their time. We are grateful to have you here with us today. And moreover, I would also like to thank the participants at this webinar. We are happy so many are following us today. So that's all from my side, and I'm wishing you all a fruitful webinar and an interesting discussion. So the floor is yours, Karl.
Thank you, Anna-Kira, for this brief introduction, and thank you also from my side to the two speakers today and to the many attendees that we already see here online. Today's webinar is about two very special cases of autonomy that some of you will be more familiar with and others a bit less maybe. So we don't have only here special cases of autonomy, we also have some two very special guests here who are really key experts on both of these cases. And I would like to introduce first the person who is a bit farther away from me, because Elisabeth is just across the corridor on the other side here. So I start with Spiliopoulou Åkermark. Sia has been the director of the Åland Peace Institute since 2007. She's a lawyer with a special focus in international law and has done a lot of work for the Council of Europe, especially on national minorities, also a lot of work for the OSCE. And apart from minorities, her foci are self-government issues, collective security, and especially the peaceful resolution of conflicts. And in the first place, of course, the case of the Åland Islands. Sia, we are very happy to have you in this webinar with us. And the second expert here today is Elisabeth Alber, who is in the first place a very dear colleague of mine here at the Institute for Comparative Federalism at Eurac Research. And she is also a senior researcher at our institute, focusing mainly on intergovernmental relations in federal systems, territorial autonomies, and participatory deliberative democracy in federal systems. But apart from her affiliation with Eurac, she is also a lecturer at the Department of Political Science at the University of Innsbruck. So just a few words about how we intend to proceed in this webinar, the format. The two speakers will give very short, very brief introductions into the two cases so that we all have a basic level of understanding of South Tyrol and the Åland Islands, so covering the milestones of the development of those two cases of autonomy. So each of these two presentations will take no longer than 10 minutes, as agreed with Sia and Elisabeth. And then I will open the floor to questions from you, the audience, and you may put your questions in the QA sections, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. And I will then read those questions and ask those questions to the two experts. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to you, Sia, to start with your brief introduction into the case of the Åland Islands. Thank you.
Thank you, Karl. It's very nice and a great honor to be in this seminar together with Elisabeth. We have worked together before on a number of occasions, most lately as a part of the work of Eurac on indicators on integration. So it's a great opportunity now to have this possibility to discuss also autonomy experiences and comparative autonomy experiences. I will start sharing my screen, and I know that you will see not only the main slide, or I think you do not only see the main slide, but also the other ones. This is not the case for me, but have patience. I will stick to my 10 minutes and we will go through it. So instead of sticking to the overall concept of durability, which was at the invitation and the core theme of the seminar, I chose the concept of resilience, and I think I will return to that later on. And instead of starting with the big flag or some of the many symbols of the Åland Islands or nice pictures, I take a non-Ålander, the poet and feminist Edith Södergran, who was born in St. Petersburg. She was also a polyglot and a Swedish speaker, and who wrote a lot in Swedish. And she published in 1918 after her family had lost everything during the Russian Revolution and had to withdraw to the Finnish mainland. This September Lyre poems, which start off by an introduction saying, "My self-confidence relies on the fact that I have discovered my dimensions. It behooves me not to make me less than I am." And I find very interesting, both in terms of the feminist connotations, looking at the clear links between minorities and feminism, but also the fact that she has the dimensions in the plural and makes a clear point of being a self-confident and a person with its own will. And I start with this since, in fact, the motto of the 100th anniversary of the official motto of the Åland government is 100 years of willfulness. I don't think that they have, the organizers or those who conceived the motto, have thought of Edith Södergran in any case. But among the ways of explaining willfulness, the official, can I say, propaganda or the motto says, willfulness to us means raising a voice for peace in a world filled with conflict. And of course, in 2020, when they were writing these things, they had no idea what the climate we are now experiencing would be. And of course, a quick overview of the basic of the Åland Islands, starting by the fact that we now have 30,000 inhabitants, and it's an archipelago in the middle of the Baltic Sea. It started its international career, if you so want, by being demilitarized in 1856 at the end of the Crimean War. And after the Finnish independence at the end of 1917, breaks out the civil war, sometimes referred to as the Freedom War in Finland, a war which meant nearly 40,000 deaths, mainly among the red side, but in a population of less than 3 million people. This was not the first time Finland, or the territory that we today call Finland, had been under a sharp decrease of its population. In 1866 and 1868, between 1866 and 68, Finland experienced the Great Hunger Years, which is the last main hunger in Europe, meaning a loss of 8.5% of the population. In some areas, almost 20% of the population. The Åland Islands were fortunately not that hit by the famine. So Finland was not a very, how would you call it, a very easy territory or an easy, happy democracy, rich and happy as they say, at least, that we are today. In 1918, the first Finnish constitution was adopted, and then the bilingual mode of Finland is established and entrenched, with the Swedish speakers and the Finnish speakers at the level of legal constitutional equity. And at the same time, the dispute of the Åland Islands is taking place between Sweden and Finland, which were in fact close to an armed conflict, and solved by the League of Nations through a complex arrangement and agreement building on three main issues: the Swedish language and cultural guarantees, an autonomous status within Finland, and demilitarization as well as neutralization in war for the islands. And this complex relationship is by some diplomats, for instance, called a wooden puzzle. So you cannot detract one of its elements without somehow shuffling around with everything, basically. And it has also been described as a lose-lose compromise. Everyone lost something. Everyone was reasonably unhappy. So at that time, people were more happy with, or at ease with, being unhappy. Today, we're very much more striving for the complete happiness. So a lose-lose compromise. Finland got, of course, the territory, and above all, a wide international recognition as a legal, as a rule and rule of law obeying state of a bilingual and constitutional order. The arrangement, this wooden puzzle, had domestic as well as international dimensions. We have already heard about the constitution, as well as the international agreements around this. It also combined legal and strong political elements. Then, as my time is not very much, I go through it quite quickly, and then we return to the details in the questions and answers and in the discussion. So when people talk about resilience, and there is an increasing authorship on the concept of resilience, in contrast perhaps to earlier authorship and theory around the concepts of autonomy preconditions. So what are the preconditions for a successful autonomy, as well as authorship concerning success of and strength of autonomy arrangements. So this authorship on resilience looks a lot at adaptation and the ability to adapt over time. So this is why I chose to have this approach going through the main revision. So the Autonomy Act was originally adopted by the Finnish Parliament in 1920 and was rejected by the Ålanders, and had to be amended by the Guarantee Act, which was finally accepted in 1922. And this is why this coming year, on the 9th of June, there will be big celebrations, since that was the time when the first session of the Åland Parliament took place. During the Second World War, there was a very complicated position for Finland between Germany and the Soviet Union, ending with the 1947 peace treaty, which very laconically says that the Åland Islands remain demilitarized as the state was at that time. The first revision of the Autonomy Act of 1922 took place in 1951, so just at the end of the war, and starting entry into force in 1952. So also this is an anniversary for the Åland Islands, this first revision anniversary. And the first revision meant mainly that the so-called right to domicile became legally entrenched in the Autonomy Act. And also the international complaint mechanism of the League of Nations disappeared as such from the horizon of the Åland Islands. The second revision of the Autonomy Act, all of those revisions have taken many, many years, and I think that there is a generational effect. So you see that it's about 30 or 40 years between them. So a political and a population generational effect on this. The second revision in 1991, entry into force in 1993, taking place at the end of the Cold War and modernizing the work of the parliament, as well as the list of competencies of the Åland autonomy, as well as the state responsibilities. But no one knew in 1991 that already in 1994, Finland and Åland would enter into the European Union. So almost immediately after the second revision, there was a need for a major reform, which meant amendments rather than a total revision of the Autonomy Act on issues concerning the European Union. And a specific protocol in connection to the entry of Finland and Åland in the European Union set the framework for how the right to domicile and the limitations to the right to property could fit into the system of the Åland Islands. I would also like to say that what happened later on is, of course, also a huge population development. If we take into account that in the late 19th century, the population of the Åland Islands was about 13,000 people. In last year, the population superseded 30,000 people. So in contrast to what we see in many other peripheries or outer parts of countries, the Åland Islands have succeeded attracting a population. And most of the population is born outside the Åland Islands and also outside Finland today. So the number of Finnish speakers has, with Finnish as the prime language, has remained more or less constant at the level of about 4.6%, while the number of those speaking Swedish as their first language has decreased from about 90% to less than 85% today. And this is a trend continuing as the inflow from other parts of the world is considerable, and that has, in my view, enriched the Åland Islands. With this picture, I just wanted to show you that the yellow flower, I have taken the flower picture myself during a walk. The yellow flower you see is a cowslip, which has a much nicer name in Swedish, gullviva, which means the golden primrose. It's the flower of the Åland Islands, and you find it mainly blooming in May, while the other flower is in English called a snake's head fritillaria. I don't know if you have it in South Tyrol. We have both snakes and snake's heads. Also in Swedish, the name is much more beautiful. It's called the King's Meadow Lily. So anyone who says that the Nordics are not romantic should at least not compare to the English, whose cowslip and snake's head is rather boring. On the third revision of the Åland Island autonomy, it started already by Ålandic initiative in 2010 and is still going on. And the only thing that has been revised so far is the economic system through the 7th chapter of the Autonomy Act. And I will just finish by showing you the resources that you can find at the website of the Åland Islands Peace Institute, because the Åland Islands is a very small place and with very small resources, naturally. We try to give as much as possible in this digital way, but you're all very welcome to visit as well, needless to say. But I return back to the poetry of Edith Södergran and her thinking. Her message is, I think, that even very tiny things can have a very high level of relevance and importance, and at least they are highly relevant and important to themselves. And I think it fits well for the poetry of Edith Södergran as well as for the Åland Islands. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sia, for ending on such a romantic note on the romantic soul of the North. You covered in a little more than 10 minutes 100 years of the Åland Islands. So Elisabeth has a bit of an easier task, only having to cover 50 years now. So I would immediately hand it over to you, Elisabeth, to give us a brief introduction into South Tyrol.
Thank you very much, Karl. I guess you see all my slideshow now. And yes, I do not have a poem, but I'm happy to somehow present the basic facts on South Tyrol. So as you can see, I mean, South Tyrol is part of Italy, and Italy is a regional state, and South Tyrol is the part that is basically in the very north of the Italian regional state, and it borders Switzerland and Austria. Oh, it doesn't, okay. If basically asked to basically bring some milestones and some basic facts on the autonomy, the first thought obviously goes to a historical timeline. So I brought this timeline, and I will obviously not go into details, but for those who already know a lot, actually can see it as an overview timeline. And for the others, I will present some basic facts. So first of all, South Tyrol, nowadays it has 533,000 inhabitants. Back in 1919, when it actually was annexed by Italy, it had about 90% German speakers. And today we have about 70% German speakers, 26% Italian speakers, and 4.5 Latin speakers. So these are the three main language groups we have. Back then, it was different. So in 1920, basically South Tyrol was annexed to Italy, and then it actually suffered Italianization policy, meaning that obviously the German language and the German culture were prohibited under fascism. There was a series of repressive measures. There were the world wars in between. There was basically also an option agreed between Hitler and Mussolini, so that German-speaking South Tyrolians could basically decide if to opt to emigrate to Nazi Germany or to remain here. Basically, the question was to renounce to the German Tyrolean culture and language and stay in South Tyrol, or basically to emigrate. And this was obviously socially a very difficult period. This was in 1939. At the end of the Second World War, because of geopolitical reasons, basically the decision was that South Tyrol remained with Italy. So basically the Brenner Pass remained the border, and South Tyrol actually remained. A very fundamental document, basically anchoring the South Tyrolean autonomy internationally, is the so-called Gruber de Gasper Agreement. It's an annex to the Paris Treaty after the Second World War, and in essence, it says that Italian citizens and German speakers should have the same rights in South Tyrol. German speakers shall get special safeguard provisions. German speakers shall get the right to speak in their language in South Tyrol. There should be an ethnic quota system established. There should be the right to mother tongue education. And in general, there should be the equal status between German and Italian languages in South Tyrol. All this is basically in this one-page document called the Gruber de Gasper Agreement. At the same time, the Italian regional state was born out of the Constituent Assembly. The Italian Constitution dates back to 1948. And within basically the creation of the Italian regional state, Rome actually provided South Tyrol, but also the neighboring province, with the so-called First Autonomy Statute. What was the problem with this statute? The problem with this statute was that it actually reached out to the territories of South Tyrol and neighboring Trentino, that is predominantly Italian speaking. And the issue was that then, politically speaking, the interests of the German speakers in South Tyrol were outvoted in the regional parliament. So basically protests and several negotiation rounds were at stake, and at the day-to-day management, there were different negotiation rounds between basically Rome and the political elite, the South Tyrolean People's Party in South Tyrol. But the South Tyrolean question actually was also discussed at the international level, at the level of the United Nations, for example, in the 60s. Out of these negotiation rounds, basically the Second Autonomy Statute was elaborated. So a commission of 19 composed of South Tyrolean German speakers, but also Italian speakers nominated from central authorities from Rome, actually sat down for several years, and over 3-4 years elaborated more than 100 provisions, 137 provisions, and out of this 137 provisions called the package, basically they were then basically translated in the so-called Second Autonomy Statute, that is of 1972. What does this Second Autonomy Statute do? It keeps the region, so it keeps the region composed of the province of Trento and South Tyrol, but it actually says that the two territories, so Trentino and South Tyrol, shall have own competences. So basically in this Second Autonomy Statute, you have one part that is valid, applies to South Tyrol, another part applies to the neighboring province Trentino, and one part, a third part, applies to the region. The region itself has very few competences, while most competences were vested basically in the two territories, Trentino and South Tyrol, that together compose one special region within the Italian regional system. Why that? because there was the need to actually translate the provisions that are enshrined in the Gruber de Gasper Agreement, this international agreement of 46, into practice. What are these provisions and what did they foresee? They foresaw the establishment of a power sharing system in South Tyrol. How does this power sharing system look? If we zoom into South Tyrol, it's a consociational democracy system. And it's made up of basically 4 cornerstones. Participation is a key word, meaning that all the language groups shall participate in politics. So we do have coalition governments, so no language group, no political party can rule alone. It foresees autonomy for the language groups, meaning cultural autonomy. What does this mean in practice? It means mother tongue education, so it means group-related independent administrations in the sector of the schools, for example, or also in the sector of the culture. It also foresees a minority veto. There is a technical mechanism that can be activated as an alarm bell whenever one language group thinks that the vital interests of their own language groups are basically in danger. And it also foresees proportional representation of each group in the entire, and I repeat, the entire public sphere. So that means, in short, that all the jobs in the public, all public posts are distributed according to the strengths of the language group, and finances are distributed according to this principle as well. And for all this, obviously, you need an ethnic quota system that is based on a declaration of linguistic belonging or linguistic affiliation. And obviously, it is also based on the fact that the entire public sphere functions bilingual. So you have the right, basically, to use German and Italian in or all over South Tyrol in the entire public sphere, and in part also with private companies if they actually provide services of public utility. Special rights are enshrined also for the Ladin speakers. This is the 3rd language group in South Tyrol. Last, if we summarize basically the 2 elements that actually characterize the South Tyrolean autonomy. So at the one side, the minority protection, the protection of the German speakers within the system of the Italian regional state. And on the other side, the territorial autonomy as an element that is actually open to everybody who lives in South Tyrol, then we can say that the pillars of the autonomy are that, constitutionally speaking, from a constitutional law point of view, Rome, the central authorities, cannot amend basic provisions of the South Tyrolean autonomy without South Tyrol sitting on the negotiating table. South Tyrol has large competences. South Tyrol has also financial autonomy, and as explained, it has a very detailed power sharing system in which basically the language groups share influence and power and are separate when it comes to issues like schools or cultural things, and cooperate when it comes to major political issues. So it is, in short, a power sharing system that actually forces cooperation and separation at the same time. I will leave it here for the time being, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth, for this concise overview, not only of the history of the main milestones, but also already anticipating a bit the pillars, the fundamental pillars of that South Tyrolean autonomy rests upon. I'm sure that this has raised many questions, even though in the Q&A sections at the moment I can see only one question, but this is an occasion for me for another reminder to all participants in the audience to just write questions in the Q&A sections. Otherwise, of course, I also have prepared a set of questions to our two speakers, but I would like to keep that as interactive as possible and give you from the audience also an opportunity to make your voices heard. So there is one question in the Q&A section, which goes to Sia, a question from Andreas Misterka. How is your relation with the Finnish government? So I guess you in this case refers to the Åland Islands government. So I guess how are intergovernmental relations, bilateral relations?
Thank you. I think it's a very good question, precisely because it is multidimensional. If we start with the level of people, in general, studies of trust have shown that there is a high level of trust between populations and government in the Nordic countries. And that goes both with regard to the regional autonomy and also with regard to the state. I think this is perhaps one of the reasons why resilience is possible, that at least until now we have had a strong trust experience. Sometimes it is called the Nordic gold. Then there is the level of the institutional relationships. And I think that is a very, very good question. First, because it draws attention to the state. And much of the writings and the theory about territorial autonomy has been focusing a lot on what is happening in the territorial autonomy with the Territorial Autonomy Act, for example, and so on, while at least as important is what is happening on the side of the state. One can answer perhaps in an easy way that there is, first of all, a similar veto, the way Elisabeth described in her case, in the sense that there can be no change of the Autonomy Act without the agreement of both sides, the Åland Parliament and then the Finnish Parliament. Even though there is a lot of discussion at the moment on the Åland Islands about the effect of what is called the legality check and the constitutionality check, and the fact that when in Finland, when the Ålandic laws are checked as against the constitution, there is not an equivalent check of Finnish laws in relation to the Åland autonomy, even though the Åland autonomy is a quasi-constitutional instrument. Sorry if I get a bit too technical on this. And of course, then there is the fact that there is one representative under normal proportionality rules of elections, one representative of the Åland Islands in the Finnish Parliament. And relations depend on who sits on government and how it works, both in personal chemistry and the surrounding environment, of course.
Yeah, I guess the last point is very applicable, very true also for the South Tyrolean case. Certainly. Sia, thank you very much also for differentiating between the relations of people to the Finnish government and institutions. I guess that was very helpful. I see in the chat that there are two new questions from our dear colleague Jens Bölk. So greetings to Trento from my side here. Jens has a question for Elisabeth, and I would like to start with that and then switch back to you, Sia, with the question to you. So Jens's question for Elisabeth is the following. So on the slide, dynamic autonomy was mentioned. Now it is full autonomy. What do these concepts mean, and what is the difference between the two?
Thank you very much, Karl, and thank you very much, Jens, for the question. I mean, in origin, these concepts are political slogans, obviously, because if we actually look into literature of territorial autonomies and we question ourselves to what extent they are durable and to what extent they actually are successful, then normally those territorial autonomies are successful that manage basically to establish procedural rules. So that managed a bit to kind of get away a bit of this personal chemistry, even though the personal chemistry then actually is crucial. But still, if the personal chemistry is not there at all, those autonomies are working well who have procedures and guarantees in the back. And dynamic autonomy in the case of South Tyrol is linked to the fact that the implementation of the autonomy statute basically took much longer than actually was planned, because it actually was planned to be a process of 2 or 3 years, which is obviously not at all, was not at all the case in reality. It took 20 years, and from 72 till 1992. It was 20 years when basically the handshake was figuratively between Austria and Italy, and basically it was said that the conflict was settled and all the provisions of the autonomy statute were actually translated into practice. And from there, relations between Rome and South Tyrol continued, because obviously also Italian regionalism continues. It's a permanent process of centralization and decentralization. Dynamics we know from many other systems. And so the term dynamic autonomy was actually born, because with the relations continuing, also further competences were transferred from Rome to South Tyrol by the means of special commissions, where basically representatives of both sides are sitting. And then full autonomy is basically the concept that in politics is ongoing, which should basically enhance the competence catalog of South Tyrol even further, until basically also those competences which are of secondary nature right now become then primary competences, for example. So I don't see Sia anymore, but just taking up also what Sia actually said with regard to the intergovernmental relations. This is obviously a very crucial element. And this is also a day-to-day challenge for the South Tyrolian autonomy, to find the right coordination with other territorial entities within Italy, with other regions, with the neighboring province, with Rome as a central authority. So this is daily work, and this is work in progress. In that sense, an autonomy will always be dynamic, because it allows basically to be what Sia also introduced, resilient to upcoming challenges, also from a broader viewpoint.
Thank you, Elisabeth. And indeed, as you mentioned, Sia seems to have left us, probably not voluntarily. She seems to have connection problems, but luckily we have another question to you in the meantime, that came in the meantime, from our colleague Elena, which is about South Tyrol being, of course, always and very often considered as a best practice example to be exported. We know that also from our work, of course, and a best practice example that can be exported or should be exported to other contexts. But Elena then asks, but we rarely read about what we could learn or we should learn from other autonomies. Is our situation so complex and carefully balanced that anything we add or change would disrupt this balance? So this maybe goes in the direction of the wooden puzzle that also was mentioned by Sia before, right? Of the elements being mutually dependent on each other. So how would you see that, Elisabeth? Is it just a very idiosyncratic, very specific case, or are there some elements at least, probably not the whole model? So at least that's, yeah, our position that we normally have, of course, in our work, but at least some elements could, of course, be exported, of course, in an adapted form in view of other contexts.
Sure. I would say that from a legal point of view, obviously the South Tyrolean autonomy is very complex. It's very sophisticated. All the procedures and the rules that actually are enshrined in the Autonomy Statute, and not only, if you take the Autonomy Statute, you only have half of the picture, because actually there are many more. There are implementing legislation at the one side. But apart from implementing legislation, there is a lot of legislation that has a constitutional rank that actually is more of recent times. And the content of such legislation you obviously don't find in the Statute of 1972. So what others can learn is basically to try to think of three elements: of the time element, of the trust element. You need to create some trust. You need to have time, and of the adaptability element, in the sense that you need to have clear procedures, that they actually are also in place when political chemistry is not working that well. You cannot export entire models. We have been saying that many times. With regard to the second part of the question, and I'll be short because I see Sia again, are we so complex that we cannot somehow think on how to revise the system, or how to kind of take it more flexibly? I'm thinking of the quota system. I'm thinking of schools, multilingualism in schools, and so on and so forth. We're definitely not that complex as a society if we compare it with worldwide contexts. I mean, I've been working in Southeast Asia. We all have been working in many contexts where the where society is much more complex actually than we are here. So the challenge is how to adapt an autonomy statute, the rules, the pillars I was referring actually to a very mobile society as it is now, actually, how to actually manage the balance between keeping guarantees, but also getting more diverse, and also valorizing more diversity within the autonomy.
Thank you, Elisabeth. And yeah, as you already noticed, of course, we welcome you back, Sia. So we hope that the connection will hold now, but be optimistic that everything will be fine. So as I said before, there are two questions in the Q&A section that are addressed to you, Sia. And the first one by Jens Wölk is about the financial situation of the Åland Islands. That is, of course, always a fundamental pillar. Also, Elisabeth mentioned that with regard to the South Tyrolean case, finances and spending autonomy are, of course, a key element, one of the 4 key elements, as you mentioned. So what about own tax autonomy and transfers from Finland and guarantees? So if you could just give us a brief introduction
yes,
into the
financial
financial
institution. And
institutions.
apologies, I thought that if I am in the office and I have a stable cord connection, it wouldn't happen, but still it happened. And thank you for your patience. Yes, this is a very good question. First of all, I think it is interesting that already in 1921, the League of Nations looked at thoroughly the issue of financial viability of an autonomy system. And that knowledge and insight, which perhaps had to do with the fact that this was the time when Keynes was actually highly active in the League of Nations debates, this understanding of the importance and justice aspects of the financial viability and then resilience was recognized already at that time. So this was one of the main points of the last revision. And what has happened and succeeded then is that we have had a better adaptation of the taxes returned from, so the Ålanders pay taxes to the Finnish states, and the quota level, which has now been adopted, is more accurate in relation to the increase of the population that has taken place on the Åland Islands. And of course, the islands have a financial autonomy in having their own budget. However, there is no fiscal autonomy, and that is one of the requests from the Ålandic side with regard to that issue. And the Åland Islands have had a relatively stable and successful economic development, in particular after 1970, when the ferry transports increased. So issues of infrastructure and transport, I think, is something which is crucial in very many cases, also some of the conflicts that are considering autonomy solutions. And finally, I wanted to say that there are other systems, for example, in major infrastructural projects where it is possible for the state and the Åland Islands to agree on what levels there should be additional transfers, for example, with regard to electricity cables. I think I stick to that for the moment.
Thank you so much, Sia. There is another question to you coming from Kashmir. A question about the role of the kin state in your case. What was the contribution or not of the kin state with regard to the durability of Åland Islands autonomy?
Yes, thank you very much. I think that this is, of course, a major question also for South Tyrol. And the relations of the kin state, of course, Sweden was highly disappointed at some level in 1921, overcoming disappointment and starting kind of living with failures, if you so want, is one of the most difficult things, both for us personally as well as institutionally and nationally. So the good thing was, of course, that the solution of the Åland Islands coincided with a shift of Swedish politics towards multilateralism and internationalism. So Sweden basically opted for strengthening its internationalist and multilateralist profile, and then gave up the ambitions with regard to the Åland Islands. And that has meant that today, still today, there is a general consulate of Sweden on the Åland Islands. So Sweden is looking at such things as the guarantees on the language and helping in matters of education, but sticks to what I think the Venice Commission has worked wonderfully about concerning the cautious position that a kin state should adopt, not interfering in the internal affairs of neighboring countries. But then at the international side, there is also a clear position of Sweden as a party to the demilitarization, neutralization treaties. So that remains.
Thank you, Sia. Maybe Elisabeth also, that is a question that is relevant to the South Tyrolean case. So maybe you could also say a few words about that question, the clean state question with regard to South Tyrol, as we also had the OSCE Bolzano recommendations precisely also adopted here and discussed here at an event several years ago, precisely about the topic of clean state involvement.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Austria is the kin state of South Tyrol, and it was also the relations between South Tyrol and Tyrol in Austria. So I'm referring to Innsbruck, for example, for those who listen to us from more far away, have been crucial in basically implementing the statute. Just think of basically developing also terminology or trainings to actually set up a public administration system that fully works in two languages. I mean, you can use German or Italian throughout all the territory of South Tyrol. With all civil servants, you have the right to get all your documentation in two languages, and you can use it also in the judiciary. So for all these things, from a very practical way, the relations with German-speaking countries, the neighborhood, and primarily Austria, have been fundamental. Also there in Austria, just to mention a very practical example, at the University of Innsbruck, already back in the 80s, basically, there have been agreements to establish within the Faculty of Law, a course that is called the Integrated Law course to train basically South Tyrolians in Innsbruck, so at the University of Innsbruck, but also in Italian law, so, and then they can exercise basically also within the Italian system / within the Italian system in South Tyrol in German language when it comes to law professions. On the political side as well, obviously Austria has always been and is still the kin state. There are different persons and different committees that actually also in Vienna deal with South Tyrol, and there are regular exchanges between the governor of South Tyrol and politicians from Austria. And the governor of South Tyrol also regularly sits in meetings within discussions with basically authorities in Vienna, but also in the neighboring land Tyrol. And the last issue to mention is that obviously these relations at the border here, at the Brenner border, actually then also led, together with the European integration process, to the establishment of a very vivid cross-border cooperation. So now institutionalized since 2011 by the means of a European grouping of territorial cooperation, so EGTC, if we want to put it technically. So meaning that Tyrol, so an entity of the Federation of Austria, South Tyrol, and Trentino basically form one European region and also set up services for the citizens of all the three entities. For example, a common avalanche warn system, just to mention an example and to get it more practical.
Thank you, Elisabeth, also for these practical examples that very much illustrated your points. So we are slowly running out of time. We have many questions still in the Q&A section. So unfortunately, we won't be able to discuss and answer all those questions during the webinar, but I guess you can reach out to the two experts and they will be willing to answer those questions. One question, a final question, would be, because it really came up repeatedly in the Q&A section, and it was also a question that I, of course, wanted to ask, is a bit to scratch a bit on the surface of these often called model examples of South Tyrol and the Åland Islands, what would you see as the main challenges, the main problems of those two arrangements, and how could or should those problems be addressed? So I ask you for very brief answers because it's almost 6. We have only a few minutes left. So, but just in a few keywords, what are the main problems from your point of view? Maybe Sia, you could start first. Yeah, thank you.
I think that the main problem is the resilience, our resilience in our trust in law and institutions. If we continue agreeing and sticking to our agreements, continue negotiating compromise, then it will succeed. Otherwise, it will not. And Lloyd's of London are operating in 3 scenarios: cooperation, competition, and chaos. So it's up to us.
Elisabeth, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, in 2 sentences, I mean, South Tyrol's model is based on a so-called dissociative model. So that means that you separate groups and you give the different language groups their spheres of influence. But if you look into empirical data, looking how civil society, maybe how civil society gets organized, NGOs that work cross-language groups and so on and so forth, and the calls also for multilingualism in the schools. So the challenge is basically to turn the model in a more associative model, so in a more cooperative model, while keeping the guarantees, which should be there in the back, basically, because they relate to the minority protection. But govern the territory in a more participatory way and cooperative way across language groups, with also languages that are not exclusively the ones that actually are institutionalized for the system as such, because we have 138 language groups actually in South Tyrol, and not just the 3 for which actually the model is established.
Thank you very much to both of you for those insightful and very short last answers. So just to wrap up this webinar now in 1-2 minutes, I'm sure that everyone has had some takeaways from these from this really interesting 1 hour, and I certainly learned a lot as well. So there are 3 key points that I noted down here, and one is the image of the wooden puzzle that you mentioned, Sia, which is really a nice one because it really shows how different elements of an autonomy arrangements are complementary, how they are interdependent, right? So Elisabeth, you showed that with those 4 pillars, where of course the competencies depend on the finances, which is clear. Otherwise, you cannot carry them out in a meaningful way. And it's the same also the 3 elements of the Åland Island autonomy. They are mutually independent, and if you change one of those elements, it will also affect the other 2. So language rights, militarization, and autonomy itself. So this is one point, I guess, that is very important. And the other a very interesting statement was the lose-lose compromise, as you called Sia, the Åland Island arrangement. And that is, I guess, true for every compromise, and certainly also for the South Tyrolean case. And it reminded me of a famous quotation by Joram Dienstein of what autonomy is. So usually autonomy is reluctantly granted by one side, and it is ungratefully received by the other side. So that's just the nature of compromise, of course. So so I take those 2 points with me today in this evening. And I think this webinar was really, really interesting with many questions, and it was very interactive. And we've had more than 60 participants, which is, I guess, quite a success in times of increasing Zoom fatigue. But there are more webinars to come, as Anna Kira mentioned before. the three institutes that organized together this webinar here have also this project of an online resource on world autonomy arrangements, and where you can find case studies not only on South Tyrol and on the Åland Islands, but actually 15 case studies at the moment, and this is constantly expanded. And it is precisely those case studies which are also the topic of this webinar series. So we hope that you will also join us for our future webinars and will bear with us. So good evening to everybody, and goodbye. I hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. We continue the celebrations. Bye-bye.